Welcome back, everyone. The great game, the other great game, Britain for the United States, 1914 to 1922. We know this is going to be heavily, particularly on the World War One, on the Great War, and then a little bit after that. Let's jump right in.
Upon the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, there seemed little reason on either side of the Atlantic to suppose that the conflict should involve the United States, though a small minority, including Roosevelt, began to press for American intervention on the side of the Entente. The Wilson administration declared the country's neutrality with popular support. This suited Britain well enough in 1914. However, once hopes for a short conflict had been swept aside, potential problems in the Anglo-American relationship began to reveal themselves. British strategy relied on using the strength of the Royal Navy to blockade the Central Powers. The nature of blockade inevitably meant intercepting American trade with the European continent to starve Germany of supplies. At the start of the conflict, Britain defined the parameters of the blockade fairly laxly. As a result of fierce American protests, contraband was limited to just war material and supplies destined for the German military.
I mean, the German military is just impressive at this point with what they can do. Obviously, trench warfare through Belgium and France is going to limit a lot of the expansiveness that they will see, obviously, in World War II. Nevertheless, in terms of the naval side, they do have a contingent of naval ships, Germany does, but the real secret weapon, obviously, is going to be the U-boats, the U-boat warfare, which, of course, will eventually bring the United States into the fold. But interesting that this part of the sea is the only part of the sea that they are particularly blockading, given if they not have the intelligence of the U-boats, or if they do, how do they track them? It's very much a simple, it's an interesting thing. Let's keep going.
Berlin's decision to engage in unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915, however, saw Britain widen the definition of contraband to include almost all goods being imported into Germany. The fact that Britain had only expanded the blockade in response to German naval actions made it harder for the United States to decisively contest, especially after the sinking of the Lusitania in April 1915 by a German U-boat led to the death of 128 Americans, with the manifest showing it was carrying small arms ammunition not being considered sufficient justification for the German action. It also helped that whereas British diplomats were patient and accommodating where possible with Washington's concerns, and extremely careful in tailoring their policy not to overstep the limit of the American public's goodwill, their German counterparts tended to display a high-handed disregard for US opinions. Nonetheless, tensions with Washington over the blockade remained fraught.
And what does our diplomacy look like with Germany over the last 130 years? You know, a lot of that they're Prussia. So what was our diplomacy like?
It was the last straw, fulminated Wilson, when Britain and France blacklisted American firms accused of trading with the enemy in 1916. In response, he authorized another enormous program of naval expansion, awarding $500 million over 3 years. Let us build a navy bigger than hers, and do what we please, he
I mean, we can, obviously, because we saw in the previous video the steel production and coal production is 30x, 10x what that is in London, so we definitely can.
declared. Blockade was just one area of friction in the war. The other considerable issue until 1917 was the question of finance. At the start of the conflict, London was the centre of the world's economic system, and other members of the Entente rapidly became dependent on Britain to underwrite their war effort.
Just as they did in Napoleonic Wars, just as they did in so many others, so not surprised.
Funding this meant an extraordinary amount of borrowing, particularly for Britain, which by 1916 negotiated loans on behalf of all Entente members. As collateral, the Treasury drew on Britain's reserves an immense overseas investment, organising, for example, a forced purchase scheme for private holdings of first-class North and Latin American securities, which were exchanged for domestic government bonds. These foreign assets then provided security for the billions of dollars worth of Entente borrowing from Wall Street. The fundamental change in the Anglo-American relationship for the rest of the century occurred here. To fund the war effort, Britain had taken to effectively borrowing from private investors in the United States.
And just like that, I think the shift of power starts right there.
facilitated mainly by JP Morgan and crucially in dollars. Britain could have avoided this dependence on the United States, but to oversimplify, it would have involved cannibalising her own economy in the grossly irresponsible way Berlin did, as well as reducing the tempo of offensives due to a lack of dollars with which Britain could buy material from the US. Thus, by the end of July 1916, American investors had staked $2 billion on an Entente victory. The problem facing the Wilson administration was that this would soon make the United States' investment in the Entente war effort too big to fail. For Wilson, the rapidly mounting British debt promised to cause real problems for his grand strategy. Unlike Roosevelt, who saw the war as a chance for the US to finally establish itself as a great power equal to the Europeans via intervention in the conflict, Wilson believed it was an opportunity to usurp them totally, without intervention.
I mean, against Roosevelt's point, we definitely already are a great power at this time, given what happened in 1898, as well as like the industrial and economic gains that we've made in the last 40 years.
He hoped to use Britain's increasing dependence on Wall Street to end the war on American terms, which, outlined vaguely in 1916, involved freedom of the seas and limitations on armaments, kept in check by an association of nations the United States would join and presumably lead. As discussed, however, there was a real risk of American investors becoming too committed to the Entente war effort, shortening Wilson's window of opportunity to act decisively. It was in this context a clash between Washington and London became inevitable. The Lloyd George government that came to power in December 1916 remained Atlanticist in its outlook. If the United States would stand by Great Britain, the entire world could not shake the combined mastery we would hold over the seas, Lloyd George had earlier declared to Colonel House. But its faith was to be badly shaken. On the 27th of November, as JP Morgan prepared to launch a new Anglo-French bond issue to raise $1.5 billion for the war effort, Wilson pushed the Federal Reserve, against its better judgment, to announce it was no longer desirable for American investors to increase their holdings in British and French securities. Wall Street plunged and sterling was offloaded by investors en masse. JP Morgan and the British Treasury were forced into emergency purchasing of sterling to prop it up. The British cabinet concluded that Wilson meant to force them to end the war within weeks by throttling its ability to borrow. Wilson raised the temperature further when he issued his peace note on December the 18th, calling on both sides to state what aims could justify the war's continuation. It was an open effort to delegitimise the conflict. In London and Paris, the reaction was immediate. George V is said to have wept, the cabinet was furious, the London Times was dismayed that Wilson had implied there was no difference between the two sides. Fortunately for the Entente, the Central Powers rejected the President's offer of mediation first, allowing them to do the same. The war would continue, but Britain's dependence on American finance to wage it continued to grow, and since the abandonment of the abortive bond issue in December, Britain's financial situation in Washington was perilous. To cover purchases in the US running at $75 million per week, in January 1917, Britain could muster no more than $215 million in assets in New York. Beyond that, it would be forced to use the Bank of England's last remaining gold reserve.
Okay, he's gonna read it. He's not gonna read it. To oversimplify, Britain had roughly 8 weeks worth of funds to pay for purchases in the US. This does not mean Britain was broke. The domestic financial situation was fairly stable and far better than Germany's. The question was British access to funds. Okay, got it.
Which would cover no more than 6 weeks of procurement. The only solution if Britain wanted to still fight the war with American goods was to ask JP Morgan to relaunch the abortive bond issue and once again reckon with the President. On the 22nd of January, Wilson explicitly staked the United States' claim for world leadership with a speech to the Senate that called for a new international order based on a League of Nations. He outlined his wish for a peace without victory, or, in his mind, a peace of mutual exhaustion for the European powers, including Britain,
a compromise,
from which the United States could emerge as the global leader of a new international order. Although Wilson viewed himself as playing the disinterested neutral, all he had really done was leave the door open for Germany, which then held the upper hand territorially, to win this peace without victory. The German ambassador, Bernstorff, correctly surmised that Wilson's continued throttling of the financial markets would be far more useful in Germany's war against Britain than any U-boat campaign. As always, however, OHL could be relied upon to astonish the world with its almost mystical ability to pick the completely wrong option. On the 31st of January, the US was officially informed that unrestricted submarine warfare, suspended after American protests in 1915, was to resume. On the 3rd of February, Congress approved the breaking of diplomatic relations with Germany. Wilson was to be robbed of his chance to play the role of global peace arbiter. Many in Wilson's administration now wanted to commit the nation fully to the Entente, and despite the fact that such an alliance may well upend London's leadership of the nations ranged against Germany, Britain was quick to push for the entry of the United States. Morgan's cannot be regarded as a substitute for the proper diplomatic authorities, announced the ambassador to Washington.
Very true. Like, where's the precedent? Come on.
But Wilson continued to delay a full commitment, insisting greater justice would be done if the conflict ended in a draw. It was
yeah, but
finally the lunatic, even by OHL standards, Zimmerman telegram, which invited Mexico to attack the US, that finally forced Wilson's hand. On April the 2nd, he abandoned
what a Hail Mary that was too.
Once and for all his hopes of America playing the disinterested arbiter, and asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Even now, however, Washington's support was qualified. The United States did not join the conflict as a full member of the Entente, but as an associate power. Wilson was determined that the US was still to play the role of world arbiter he had arranged for it. Even so, it cannot be understated how important American entry was for the Entente war effort. In the summer of 1917, there was a very real risk of Britain defaulting on its loans from Wall Street since 1915. The US declaration of war thus provided enormous relief, with Washington providing Britain an unprecedented $250 million advance in April, with over $3 billion to follow pending congressional approval.
$3 billion? Dang, that's crazy, especially back then.
The fact it took Congress longer than expected showed just how dependent Britain had become on the US. In the last days of June 1917, Britain came within hours of insolvency. But with the US as a co-belligerent, the real risk to Britain and the Entente was gone. Instead of the uncertainty surrounding private finance from Wall Street, Britain was now able to rely on the more stable government-to-government lending. American troops arrived slower than expected to Europe, so much.
That's London. Yeah, that's right in front of Buckingham.
So that the Entente came within a hair's breadth of losing the war in the 1918 German offensives. Britain might be forced into complete dependence on the United States to protect against a German-dominated Europe, shrieked some hysterical British statesmen. Ultimately, the crisis unified rather than split the alliance, and British shipping was freed up to rush 250,000 Americans across the Atlantic every month in mid-1918. Their contribution in the actual fighting was mainly in psychological rather than quantifiable military terms. The arrival of American troops undoubtedly buoyed the morale of all Entente armies, though it was largely Anglo-French troops and material that delivered the string of shattering blows to the German military in late 1918.
Which is a different story for a different time, talking about, how well, there's a lot going on for World War I, the Great War. I really want to get into more history around the Great War. We will in time. But yeah, that front right there from the sea to like Luxembourg is just crazy. It's a crazy trench warfare that has gone on for 4 years, 5 years almost.
And forced them to an armistice.
4 years.
The question of who would dictate the peace was then an open-ended one. Britain and France had undeniably won the war against Germany, yet they had done it on the back of American finance, which factor entitled which power to a greater voice at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 wasn't clear. Although American negotiators realised the practical necessity of working with Britain in particular, Wilson certainly believed he knew who should dictate the terms.
He
declared the US would force them to our way of thinking when the war was over. By that time, he calculated, they will be financially in our hands. In early 1918, Wilson had announced his 14 points as...
Alright, so let's go over them. The end of secret diplomacy, freedom of the seas, removal of economic barriers between states, reduction in armaments, impartial adjustment of colonial claims, German withdrawal from Russia, Belgium, and France, Italy frontiers readjusted along the lines of nationality. Can't remember what. I think that's mainly for Austria's sake, against Austria. Autonomous development for the peoples of Austria, Hungary. I think that's more towards Hungary. The Balkan states are liberated. That's very interesting and huge. The end of Ottoman Empire. Creation of an independent Polish state, which is very, very huge. And a General Association of Nations to guarantee territorial integrity of states. Basically create an arbiter, a pre-UN.
The basis for any peace. These lofty principles concealed the weakness that, according to Keynes, the president had thought out nothing. When it came to practice, his ideas were nebulous and incomplete. He had no plan, no scheme, no constructive ideas. Or as Clemenceau more bluntly put it, God has his 10 commandments, Wilson his 14 points, we shall see. Europe did see. Wilson's greatest contribution to the New World Order, sanctimony aside, was the League of Nations, an
pre-UN basically.
internationalist body designed to prevent future conflicts. Yet it was immediately rendered ineffective by the United States' refusal to join.
Congress didn't join.
Republicans in particular feared the wide commitments of the League threatened American sovereignty. The US would give back to George V what it took away from George III, warned.
That's interesting. Give me the people that know, give me some more context. Like, why really did we not join the League of Nations? What was the main reasons? And I know there were probably a few, but what were the main reasons? Are they scared to join? Are they assuming that if they join, something's going to occur? XYZ.
William Borough, and Britain, the only other great power, was in no position to enforce the League on her own. British delegates hardly distinguished themselves as far-sighted visionaries either, and there were as many conflicting aims in the British party as there were statesmen attending the conference. Lloyd George, the deceiving half-human goat-footed bard in Keynes'
Dang! Is he not liked?
View, wasn't much trusted by anyone, and thus his attempts to bridge the gap between French revanchism and American idealism were always destined to be inadequate. The ultimate Versailles settlement, followed by further treaties with the other Central Powers, helped set the stage for another more disastrous war. An attempt to apply the Wilsonian principle of self-determination to an ancient continent crisscrossed by the racial and dynastic wars of a millennium proved unstable from the start. The immediate post-war era did nothing to reverse the new financial balance between Washington and London. Britain was owed around 4 times the £1 billion it owed the United States, though Balfour announced she would only collect what was needed to pay her debts to Washington, an offer that actually came off looking underhanded to both the French and the Americans. Britain continually asked the US to join in some form of debt write-down with them, to no avail. Wilson did offer to extend the deferral of interest that had previously been arranged on British loans, but wanted in return a formal commitment to avoid any discrimination against American trade in the imperial market, furiously rejected by the Chancellor. Britain's precarious financial position was worsened when debt repayment terms were finally arranged with the US in 1923. These saw London agree to repay $160 million a year, far in excess of what the Treasury thought feasible. Poor old Bonelaw, the new Prime Minister, was reduced to complaining anonymously in the Times. It was a remarkable turnaround in the financial relationship between the two powers, although the ultimate display of the new basis for Anglo-American relations had been a year earlier at the 1922 Washington Naval Conference. At the conference, Britain, who in a striking bit of symbolism was invited on the same terms as Italy and France, agreed to naval parity in capital ships with the United States. It was a very public display that Britannia no longer ruled the waves. Only 10 years earlier, Britain had convincingly defeated German attempts to challenge the Royal Navy's supremacy, Now, a simple threat from Washington of a renewed naval arms race saw Britain agree to formally give up its hegemony over the oceans for good. 1922 confirmed what had been known even before 1914, that the United States was now a great power capable of rivaling the British Empire in almost
I mean, like I said before, I thought that at 1898.
every conceivable way.
Yeah, that's. I love how he lists the sources. I've never seen that before. Um, it's interesting. Something that we could definitely look at in the future. But it seems like World War I, as we're kind of learning more and more about the relationship between Great Britain and the United States, and well, it's the United Kingdom and the United States, because that's what it really is, right? Um, just thinking out loud. But what we basically have a relationship that's pretty much a codependency really up until World War I, and now we're seeing a dependency of Britain to US. But before that, it was pretty much codependent between financial and military aid and so forth. And it seems like this war right here created a balance change amongst the United Kingdom. Obviously, there's the colonial losses they're going to suffer in the 20th century. Obviously, there's also the naval checkmate where they are no longer the ocean arbiter. Now they will share that title with other great powers. France, Germany, XYZ, future Japan at this point too, really. Like Japan's also got a naval power that would rival Britain, I would say, at this time. Um, Obviously the United States, that goes without saying. But it's interesting though to see like the dynamic really shift right here at the World War I, and then how this next how the 1920s and 30s will go. You'll see one of the same some of the same when it comes to the codependency to dependency. So you go to codependency to dependency. However, the United States definitely it's a spectrum. It's not like a black and white. I would say there's still a little bit of codependency probably between the United States and Britain, but it's probably like 75-25, 75% dependent UK dependent on Britain, 25% vice versa. And that just really has to do with an economic entry to the Europe. Obviously, we have probably good diplomacy with the other European states, but to a default, UK has a really interesting buying force that will allow us to continuously grow within the market. But whether it be like the different tycoons in the United States, or the industrial growth and our GDP growth that occurs from businesses and resources being used, that really allows us, as we've seen in the last 30-40 years with our steel production, coal production, and everything else going, with the railroads and every other technology just innovating, becomes it just festers to create a power of this magnitude. Especially, I mean, if you think about, like, if the United Kingdom is as big as like what, like a couple of the United States. So like in territory alone, the vast resources, and we have two oceans. We're pretty much hegemonic at this point. Not quite. I wouldn't say we're hegemonic till probably the 1960s. Well, actually, I would say I would say the 90s, actually, to be 100% fair. We are a hegemonic power, uh, for the most part. In co we're co-hegemonic with Russia to, like, I don't know. I'll have to learn a little bit more about it, but probably the 70s or 80s when they start to go the opposite direction. And then at this point we're still the hegemonic power in the United States. Or sorry, in the world. I mean, you can definitely say China, but in terms of like influence in the US dollar, still pretty strong. But it's an interesting this is an interesting dynamic that I'm learning. Leave me some context below, because I mean, Old Britannia he's really smart. He's a really smart dude. So he knows exactly what he's talking about. But leave me some context, leave me some video suggestions down below. I appreciate you guys as always. Peace out and bye bye.